Go after investors that actually understand the problem. So you're not debating the problem, you're actually selling your solution, you're selling your story, right? You're not selling the market. And that was a big learning. Do not try to sell the market, sell your story.
This is Funded, a show where founders who raised millions in venture capital share the gritty side of what it actually took to get that money in the bank. I'm Jason Ye. Not too long ago, I was trying to get my ideas funded. And back in the day, I was a VC listening to founders pitch me for money. Most of us have heard the saying, good things don't come easy. And I'd be willing to argue that the majority of people agree with that statement on some level. But sometimes good things do come easy, and then they get harder. And it's in those pivotal moments where you really get to see what you're capable of. That was the case for today's guest, Mohak Nahta, founder and CEO of Atlys, a company he started as a side project to solve his own problems of getting his visa on time when traveling. Turns out a lot of people had a similar problem, and that allowed him to raise a seed round back in 2021, led by one of the biggest venture firms in the game, Andreessen Horowitz. Fast forward to going out to raise his Series A, and things didn't come as easily. To be honest, Mohak was experiencing the exact opposite of easy. But instead of dropping the ball and giving up, Mohak did what any great founder does. He changed his strategy and tried again. Let's just say his luck was a bit different the second time around. But before we get into the outcome of his Series A, let's rewind the clock to hear about Mohak's childhood, all the way across the pond in India.
Before Atlys and before I was in the US, I actually grew up in India, and I was there until high school. And for college, for my undergrad, I moved to the US, right? And as a child, right, like I loved tinkering with things. I loved sort of building stuff, and I was always interested, sort of, by the idea of just building small things, or like Lego and so on and so forth. Nothing crazy. But I also was, so grew up in a business family, which is to say that, the family ran a business operation. So, dinner table conversations were all about the business. And honestly, I'm not a pro at running a business still, but I got a lot of exposure, right, into how a business is run just growing up. So kind of a weird mix where, like, okay, I got exposure in business, but I was never interested in the business part of things. I was always interested in building stuff and, like, thinking of new ideas and, like, trying to do crazy things.
So your parents, they're entrepreneurs, it sounds like. And I want to ask you this because I've been thinking about this for my niece and nephew and other parents, friends of mine who are starting to raise kids. And it's always interesting to think about like what you expose your kids to as a little kid or what you push them to do. Did your parents push you to do certain things either on the building or engineering side of things, or things that as you look back are much more about like how to think like an entrepreneur, how to sell, how to talk to customers? What were you pushed to do by your parents?
Great. Yeah, great question. So, the reality is that I wasn't pushed to do anything, in the sense that, like, it was very open, whereas where I could just do anything and everything I wanted. I wasn't pushed to take certain classes. I wasn't pushed to, like, study more. I had full freedom. And what that freedom meant was that I was able to find my own interests. And, I remember as a child, my interests change every 3 months, right? Because, again, like, when you're not pushed into something, the flip side is that as a child, you'd always change your interest. But in retrospect, that's very valuable, right? Because I was exposed to so many things, and that was, I think, that was very important. I always had to figure stuff out, right? And I felt that, like, that level, or like street smartness is what I say, like, that you develop early on, becomes extremely and critically useful later on, especially when you're an entrepreneur, because, like,
Yeah.
all you have to do is just
So
figure
like
stuff
the
out.
focus on problem solving. So on
Exactly.
one side, you definitely had a lot of reps around problem solving. Tell me a little bit about your openness to talk to people, and how outgoing were you versus how introverted you were.
Yeah, so I mean, very outgoing. So I was also a single child, so very outgoing, and I think, I don't know, maybe it's just uh, a function of who I am and my personality. But have always been an extrovert, so I was always outgoing from the very early days. And
That's that's a powerful combination. You don't always see that combination of that sort of builder mentality paired with the extroversion and your interest in connecting with people, which I've definitely felt throughout our relationship together. So tell me a little bit about the start of Atlys, especially as it pertains to your thinking that you wanted to build a company where you would raise money for. Um, and in a lot of funded conversations, we'll talk about a very specific fundraise, but there's something that I've seen in you over a number of fundraises, your angel round, your seed, your series A, that I want to pull out. And so we're going to start from the beginning. Tell me a little bit about where Atlys came from, and then your thought that I'm going to raise capital for this business.
Absolutely. Look, so before Atlas, I was working at Pinterest, first as an engineer and then for some time as a product manager, right? And before that, I was at school at CMU. Now, at CMU, I had a lot of different ideas, and at Pinterest also had an idea that I almost sort of explored, but I didn't do a good job, right? And the reason this is important is that what I learned, and it was actually an interesting idea. It was called Air Dash, and what I realized was that whenever I would travel, especially back to India for holidays, people would always ask me to bring iPhones and MacBooks, and because there was price arbitrage, so I built this marketplace where I would get people who are travelers to just take stuff for others and then keep the margin. And
Yeah.
at some point, people didn't weren't willing to do so because, well, I think it was kind of illegal. So I got pilots because their bags aren't checked, right, to do this. But what I realized was that I focused on everything that one shouldn't focus on, which is like, okay, I focused on the marketing side of it. I focused on all the talking, but I didn't focus on something that's very basic, product, right? So I'm like, okay, I don't know how to build a product. So when I was at Pinterest, I found the best person to who there at product, who was the head of product, Lawrence, at that time, right? And I was like, okay, I want to learn how to build a product from you. And he said something interesting. It's like, okay, I can mentor you, or you can work with me in building internal tools, which is the most unsexy things in a big company, right? And you'll just work with me and you'll learn. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And for 1 year, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to care about my job because I always knew that I want to build a product, right? And I want to learn how to build a product. And I didn't have any idea about what startup I do if I do a startup, but I just wanted to learn how to build a product. And as I started building internal tools and like learning the art of building a product, I started thinking of problems that I can solve, the problems that I really hate, right? And I always tell other to be founders, and when they ask me, like, either you pick a problem that you're really passionate about, or you pick a problem that you really hate. Otherwise, don't pick something in the middle, right? And so the story of Atlas was interesting because since childhood, I always loved building. And now I sort of thought that, okay, I at least somewhat know how to build products. So there was a time in January of 2020 where we were going on a work trip to 5 countries. And, I am an Indian citizen going with an American crew who didn't care that we were going to 5 different countries, had to apply for 5 different visas. And I'm like, okay, this sucks. So I'm gonna just build a side project to solve my own problem. And that was how it started. And I wanted to learn iOS. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna build an iPhone app, which again, not the best of ideas. So I built Atlas as a side project with no intention to do a startup. My intention actually was to just be able to build a product and get someone to use it, right? I didn't think about doing a startup at all. And that happened, and and at some point I realized that my friends were talking about it, and then friends were using it, and then I was going to parties where people were like, oh, uh, you know can you give me the test drive version of this visa app, right? And I always knew the opportunity is huge, but there was a point where I just felt, okay, like, look, there's a huge opportunity. I have an insight and a product, so let's just do this, right? And I mean, by the way, before this, I've never networked with an investor. Well, I didn't know any investor. I hadn't, other than I wasn't even on Twitter, right? Which basically goes to show that I didn't even hear
Yeah.
of most of living in Silicon Valley. I just didn't care. I just, it was something, because I never thought I'll do a startup. It was, the year before
Yeah.
Atlas, I just wanted
Well,
to build a product.
this is going to be a great opportunity for us to pull something apart. And this is where I want our conversation to go. So you, I'm not going to pretend like you didn't have great parts of your resume, which is like, look, you went to CMU, you were an engineer at Pinterest. a hot tech company in Silicon Valley. Those are things that give you some advantages. At least on paper, it's like, wow, an engineer from Pinterest, from CMU, and some network at least within Pinterest. But as you're telling me, it was like you weren't thinking about starting a big venture backed startup at any point. You weren't networking with investors. So we want to go from where you started and then kind of to tell the story of how you raised your initial, call it angel pre-seed round with amazing names, and then parlayed that into progress and then landing a seed round from Andreessen Horowitz till that your most recent round, which is a Series A from Sequoia, among others. And
Absolutely.
there's obviously glazing over a lot of important parts about the business being amazing, but we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of fundraising momentum that you have been able to drive. And I think that all starts with the first domino of what what did you start doing at first to even start raising the angel pre-seed round, which is where I met you. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but you brought some amazing names on for that very first round. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So look, it actually happened organically, but it was sort of the winter of that year that I started Atlys, right? And so to preface, there was winter of 2022, COVID at its peak, running a travel startup, right? I left my job, zero employees, no team, no co-founder, right? The worst combination ever, right? Like literally, like and obviously no users, right? But I did have a product, and I did have a lot of insights, right? And the way I always think about the pre-seed round is that how passionately do your insights come out, right? And that's how I sort of describe it. And I just felt that because I was suffering from visas for so long and I had so many insights, and it wasn't, and I'll be honest, it wasn't that I spoke to a lot of customers or anything. It was just that I had faced this problem so much that I knew it really, really deeply. And I think my journey sort of started where, like, my closest friends at Pinterest were actually angel investors, right? So I started with them, and then they were like, okay, why don't you talk to these two or three funds that we know? And they included like South Park Commons and Four, and you know and interestingly, the way the momentum built up was very interesting. My mentor at Pinterest, who was also part of this first round angel investor program, I forgot the name, but it's a program for angel investors, and I think you were also part of it. He just took my simple deck and a pitch, and just sent it to that whole group. So everyone who was associated with first round got it, right? And it included really amazing angel investors such as yourself, right? And a lot of inbound started coming up, and they started were like, "Oh, this is cool. We want to consider investing." And at that point, I didn't even know what a safe is and whatever, right? So I was like, "Oh, wow, cool." During this time, and I was also lucky to be part of South Commons, so they knew me before, right? They were like, "Oh, by the way, we heard you're just talking to angel investors. Why are you not talking to us? We can just lead seed round." And I'm like, "Okay, great. What does leading seed round mean?" But okay, now that I learned that, so I talked to them. They move quickly. Meet Radit and Ruchi, and then they sort of come in, and then more investors come in as well, right? So my idea of raising a pre-seed round was like 300K round. It ended up being a $1.1 million round, but it all started from that email to first round fellows. And luckily, a lot of people showed inbound interest. And I think, as I said, like, how passionately your insights, because at that point, there's literally, uh, you know, for what it's worth, I just want to tell, like, whoever is listening to this, is that there couldn't have been a worse time. Like, like if you're thinking whether or not to do something that you're passionate about, there couldn't have been a worse time. And yet we were able to raise around, and, very grateful for it. But the reality is that the
Yeah.
insights have to be strong, and then you just have to have really, really a lot of conviction. And people
Yeah.
actually buy it, or like people who invest in you early on buy that. They're not buying your ability to build a product. They're not buying your ability to build a business. They're just literally buying your
Yep.
conviction to do something great.
Yeah. Let me underline a couple things because you said a number of, or you described a number of situations that all came together, and I think you picked out a few, but there are a few that stand out to me that I want to make sure I highlight. The first being that you were working on your own, like you were building something in a way that was just trying to like demonstrate being able to solve a problem. So that's one. You showed progress and you showed your ability to get your insights out and actually act on them. And then two, that combined with initial trust that your friends had in you. So people, all investors, whether or not they're your friends or not, they're looking to the future and saying like, do we think this person has the capabilities to do a bunch of crazy stuff that's going to be put in front of them? And because they had worked with you, because they had seen you, and because you had already started working, there was enough to get somebody to be your lead domino, right? Someone that's like, look, there's not much here, Mohawk. There really is not much here. And by the way, this is travel in the middle of COVID. But look, I trust you, right? And so I think that is more important than getting the email sent out to the first round list and then getting the email sent out to some other people, because those groups see a lot of deals, right? But they don't see a lot of deals with a founder who has the backing of people that they trust, who has already started building something, who can articulate a real unique insight. Okay, so that's the one thing. And the other really important thing is, along the way, Mohawk, you described a couple things, which is like, look, I didn't really think that I needed to raise money or wanted to raise money. And I'm like building in order to just build for myself, not for investors. And so the moment you go out to raise, you're like, okay, well, now I'll go raise, but you have way more than a lot of people have, when they think that they want to go raise money. And you go and say, look, I only need 300K. I only need 300K. And so being able to show traction, being able to show value far beyond the amount that you think you want to raise is one of the strongest things you can do in terms of fundraising, where people are like, oh my God, like this person only needs this amount. No, we want to give them more. It's like a very counterintuitive thing where it feels like a great opportunity and people want to jam in more, as opposed to you being like, oh, I think I want to raise like $5 million out the gate. And then people are like questioning all the different things and why it's worth that much. So I'll just say, look, that whole string of events was amazing. You got, we had the opportunity to talk. I was actually introduced to you by Julia Lipton, who's an amazing investor and whose credibility extends beyond like so many different things. You were able to get Wayne Ting, the CEO of Lime, to invest. And so now you have capital to run. You have an amazing cap table. And we'll fast forward. The next round you raise is a seed round from Andreessen Horowitz. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about how the business progressed to a point where you had it in your mind, you know what? I think I need to raise the next round of capital. What was the trigger point in your mind that was like, okay, I want to raise a seed round?
Absolutely, right? Like, so it's interesting, right? And again, like, just to reiterate, I this first time founder, and I didn't come from like this background of knowing how this works, right? So I never really thought about fundraising, right? And I was just so happy after the pre-seed round that someone's investing in me, right? But what really happened was that as COVID was sort of coming to an end, right, we found a niche, and we grew really, really, really quickly within the niche, right? So it's like, okay, we're 0, 0, 0. So we had the product, we had some money. And by the way, we were being very frugal in the sense we actually had no employees on the payroll, 2 contractors, both of them unpaid. So like, other than basic expenses, we actually our expenses were like $600-700, right? And even then I used to think, how do I cut, right? Because I'm like, okay, like this thing might never end, and I need to save this $1 million forever. So I was just scared to hire also. So I just built it, and I just was grateful for the first couple of people who just worked without any money. And I'm like, okay, we'll keep building. We'll keep talking to customers, right? And fast forward to the next fundraise. What happened was COVID was ending, and we found a niche, a small gap, and we capitalized on it. And we just grew within that niche. So it's like, one segment, one route opened up. And I still remember US to Bahamas. Bahamas was the first one to lift restrictions. And suddenly, and no one ever thought that Bahamas would have a visa for COVID. So I'm like, okay, fuck it, right? This is the only visa that's happening. We're going to capture it. And we just went ham. And luckily, Americans also didn't have anywhere else to travel. So they were also just going to Bahamas. So suddenly, we were like, okay, we're just going to capture. And then what happened was we just saw this hockey stick growth. And when I say hockey stick, right, again, people think hockey stick always means big numbers. No, it's just the rate at which you're growing is really high, but the numbers aren't. And that's the thing, the rate at which you grow matters more than the absolute number, because if you can keep growing there, right? So I was like, okay, great. And then trust me, like, it's like when you have no users and suddenly you have a lot of customers. And when I say a lot, like, I don't know, like from 0 to 40 a day, it feels good, but you're also like, trying to keep the lights on. And I read this, and to everyone sort of who doesn't know fundraising, two things that I advise them to read. One is your blogs, always, and the other is Paul Graham's blogs, because like one of the things that I read was that, oh, your goal should be to grow 7% week over week for 12 weeks. I'm like, okay, great. And I'm like, okay, I want to do that. And once we started getting customers, we grew 40% week over week from a base of zero, by the way, for like 8 weeks. I'm like, okay, this is crazy growth in the sense that it's not big enough, but we're growing. And at that point, I'm like, okay, it's time to consider racing, but we didn't have a great business. We knew the product, we had a business model, we knew the market, how it would be. But COVID was still a thing, and we had some traction, right? So I'm like, I'm going to take a different approach, and I'm going to write my thoughts down on where we are at as a company and make a memo, so not a deck. And then that's when we start seed funding raise. The biggest sort of driver of like getting people excited wasn't the memo, wasn't anything. It was just me starting with the demo of the product and showing that, look, I built something that some people are using. So got people, a lot of people excited, right? So we got a lot of seed stage. We started getting term sheets, and the thing with term sheets is that like once you get one term sheet, that's when I learned, right? It just creates this sort of, it puts almost like a time limit that, look, on every other investor other than you. So you are like fine, you have a term sheet, but it puts this,
Yeah.
it starts every other investor on a stopwatch, right? And then they all move quickly. So
Yeah.
at some point, I realized that they're actually, I don't know, it can't be rational to invest in a startup thinking about doing visas in a world where visas are mostly non-existent, and getting growth from Bahamas fucking health visa, which is not even a real visa. And
Yeah.
and so again, I think we got lucky. Towards the end, I ended up meeting Sriram from Indrecent, and I was almost decided my Series A investor, sorry, seed investors, and I was about to close. But the thing was that Sriram, like me, came from a very similar background, had done 50 visas, so it was a very instantaneous connect, right? And we just talked about our visa stories, and I'm like, okay, this guy really gets the problem, and he's like, oh yeah, like everything is good, but like he really cared about someone solving that problem, and I also cared about solving that problem,
Yeah.
obviously. And that's how A16Z came by.
Nice. Let me pull out a couple things and have you react to them. So you did happen to raise your seed round in maybe the hottest market in the history of venture capital, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of the things that were happening were a function of market getting interested, very easily the market getting excited, everything being hot at the time. Um, but one thing I did want to pull out, which I've seen throughout the life of our relationship, is that you, better than other founders, have really leveraged your cap table. The moment you did get a great cap table, you really were great at leveraging your cap table, certainly for fundraising, but also along the way and grabbing value. So can you take a couple steps back and again think about the seed round, and as you're building towards your seed round, tell me how you thought about leveraging the people that you got to invest in you, both to drive the business forward and to help you as you started your fundraising process.
Absolutely. So on point. So look, we were lucky that we got a very extensive cap table of really amazing folks during our pre-seed round, right? Look, and as I told you before, I never came from the VC world, and neither did I have, nor did I have connections, right? So when it came to seed fundraising, I knew almost no seed fund, right? And I always like, okay, look, sort of kind of selfishly, but I always think of the cap table as, look, now they've put the money in. What's the worst they can do? Like I can be honest with them that we're going down the gutter, and like what's the worst that can happen, right? They can just hate me, but that's But the other thing about what I realized was that people who invest you in the early days actually really, it's almost like they're your cheerleaders, right? Like more than the money, they're not in it for the returns. They're just there because when you're investing in just an idea, like it's not a good investment most of the times, right? So I'm like, okay, I don't have a network. These people literally know. every investor in Silicon Valley, right? So the first thing that I leveraged the cap table was, okay, is this, and I, the way I leverage the cap table is that I have a WhatsApp group with all the investors who are all over the world. And it's sort of like a community, where other investors know each other and there are jokes going on, there's conversations. And so the first thing is like, okay, is this a good time to raise? These are our, like, this is where we're at. This is where we were like eight weeks before. What do people think, right? The thing is, like, obviously when you have, like, you don't get like a
Right.
single answer for something like this, right? So at some point it's just a gut check, but like you hear enough yeses. So I'm like, okay, great. The next thing, how do you sell the story? So again, so I take a step, right? And then I ask the cap table, like, okay, what do you all think? And then after that, it was like, okay, how do I go about fundraising? And then I spoke to you, and then you explained me, and it was something that I stood struck out. Is like,
Yeah.
be chased, right? Don't chase, be chased. And so, okay, so I'm like, okay, to be chased, I need to meet all these funds. How do I meet all these funds? I then again go back to the capital. I'm like, you all make warm introductions to these funds, right? And one thing I did was that I actually found the warmest source between a seed stage fund that I wanted to talk to and
Yeah.
my angel investors, right? So it wasn't that I'm asking one person to introduce me to 10 others, or I'm asking sort of everyone
Yeah.
to introduce me to random firms. It was just like, okay, do you know this firm really, really well, or this partner really, really well? It's almost as if you're friends, you're texting buddies. Can you make a warm?
Yeah. That's awesome, man.
And because you said it was the hottest market, it was actually hard to get attention, right? If you didn't go through a warm, because there were like deals going all over the place.
I like the point Mohak made about raising in a hot market, and I think it's something a lot of founders often miss. Just because you're raising in a hot market doesn't mean it's easy to grab the attention of an investor. In fact, hot markets can mean hot competition, which can make things equally hard, just for different reasons. When we come back, Mohak shares an interesting strategy for generating heat for his round. I gotta say, it was pretty clever. Like many of you, my last venture-backed startup was a SaaS business. In that company early on, we had the opportunity to sell into a large enterprise, but ran into some walls when they asked us if we were SOC 2 certified. Not only were we not certified, we also found out that it would take our small team a ton of time to get that done, and so we ended up abandoning the deal. If you haven't run into a situation like that where a potential customer or investor is asking if you're SOC 2, HIPAA, GDPR, or ISO 27001 certified, you probably will soon. But unlike me, you could use a company called Vanta to help. Vanta helps automate up to 90% of the compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks rather than months, and eliminating up to 85% of the costs. Not only that, but Vanta can start small with you and scale up as you grow, helping you land bigger deals and earn customer trust. The best part is, Vanta is offering funded listeners $1,000 off for going to vanta.com/funded. That's VANTA.com/funded for $1,000 off your service. Check it out. Yeah. So this is what I wanted to point out is like, man, the momentum that you were able to generate really started from the first angels that you brought on, because one thing that I'll point out is you did a memo, and memos can be really valuable. I've written about this before, but what I say, so I'm more of a deck fan, and I do say memos work. What I say memos work is memos work for people that can make it work, which is a self-referential way to define it. But what I mean by that is if you are the type of founder that can make an investor spend time on a memo, investors spend on average 2.5 minutes on a deck. That's no time. That's not enough time to actually read a memo. But if you are the type of founder that can get an investor to spend time on a memo, then the memo will work for you. But most founders, especially first-time founders in the earliest stages, they don't have the gravitas to be able to get an investor to spend that time. But you, Mohak, had credibility transferred to you by your cap table. So when the warmest intros came out and they said, I have this guy named Mohak, he's amazing. And the people looked at who were making the intros and they're like, that's worth spending time on. Then I think the memo was enough to then catch people's eyes, and then that got you to the demo. Really, really important note. And I just love what you had to say about leveraging your cap table, not being afraid to ask for help, throwing them in a WhatsApp group and just learning from all the experience around the table. So that's one, just an amazing setup using the cap table. Um,
Thank you. And then the last thing that also helped, if you remember, is that momentum begets momentum, or
yeah.
like, and it amplifies. So the other thing was that this cap table is very well connected, right? They knew everyone, almost everyone. So what I did was, as we started getting any term sheets, right, started just sending it to on the on the group, right? And it was still like 30 odd people. But the thing is that these people, because they talk to investors all the time, they started talking about it naturally. Like, look, I funded this company early on, and now they have this term sheet or that term sheet, and that created more and more hype, right?
Yep.
And so we obviously started where we were chasing, like, or we were talking to investors, but we very quickly and luckily got to a point where we were being chased, and everyone wanted it, right? Just because that, okay, like, we borrowed the credibility of our investors, and
Yep.
then they actually helped amplify, or like helped sort of create the hype as well, right? And
Yep.
it's not that I called an investors and I said, okay, can you create hype, or can you talk to this? It was just very simple, right? Like, okay, we spoke to this investor, it did not go well, or we spoke to this investor and they're interested in moving forward, right? And this trusting that your cap table has the best intentions in mind was very helpful.
Awesome. So now I want to actually transition to your Series A, where the dynamics of your fundraise are going to be very different, right? When you're raising your pre-seed, it's literally your friends starting the process, then people just being like, I'm going to trust this guy, he has a demo. At the seed, we talked about it. You were growing, but you were doing Bahamas visas, right? Like, I mean, that's like not a business. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny side project still. And so we're still kind of telling this story. We're still borrowing credibility from investors. We're still really betting on a future, right? A huge future. Now, fast forward to your Series A, which you recently announced a couple months ago. We're in a different state of fundraising for a number of reasons. First, like I said, you're raising your Series A in any market. You're shifting over to really having to tell the story based on numbers more. And then the second dynamic I'll point out is that you did raise a really hot seed round. And for a lot of people, raising a hot seed round in 2021 ish has been kind of a kiss of death because you raised at a really high valuation relative to, traction. And so now, Mohawk, you're going out to raise the next round, and you're thinking about, I would love to hear what's going on in your head. You're thinking about going out to raise another round. And I know you're contemplating things like, how much runway do I have? What's happening in the business? What's happening in the market? And this is like a complicated issue to go through because it's like everyone had already started talking about how difficult the market was. So would love to hear a little bit about like where you were, how you were thinking about runway, and what was the trigger point to make you go, you know what? I think I should have serious conversations with Series A investors.
Absolutely. Look, very interesting. Our series is like a great learning experience, and honestly, like, what, and I'll tell you, like, one big mistake: raising a hot round. Like, as in, like, I gave myself a pat in the back for raising a seed round in the hottest market in 2021, right? And that was mistake number one. Like, you can't be patting your back when you raised a round in the hottest market, because your assumptions, or like your theories about how to raise a round and what it entails to raise money, are very skewed, right? So I'm like, okay, I raised the last round super easily and had 8 term sheets. So all everyone cares about is this hockey stick curve, right? And I'm like, okay, great. And there was a point where we had that hockey stick curve, and that's all we had. And I go ahead with it, right? Mistake number two was that when you raise money in a really, really hot market very, very early on, you sort of lie to yourself on what you've achieved. The reality is you haven't achieved as much as just, creating some sort of hype and having some stupid metrics to show off, right? But you do tend to think that just because you grew like from a base of zero, 40% week over week for 8 weeks, that was the reason people invested. And that was not the reason, looking back, people invested in you. But you tend to think that. So when it came to Series A, again, I wrote a memo and I got it completely wrong, because I thought, okay, all investors care about is the growth rate, right? And you've been hearing this, it's all over, it's growth, growth, growth. So all I focus is on that. And then I start raising, and totally opposite experience. One, it's taking a lot longer. Two, we're going to ICs and we're hearing no's, and a lot of no's actually don't make sense, right? But you know, and I think during this time, the most important thing to have is self belief, and to know that, look, if always remind yourself. And I used to go to bed like, look, if we don't need money, how will I make this business work, right? Because like I've always started Atlas because I want Atlas to solve this problem. It was never for fundraising or never for anything else, right? So my goal with fundraising was that, okay, we've grown a lot, we've spent quite some money growing. We're not going to go out of business if we don't raise, but we will obviously need to change course, right? And we'll have to sort of become profitable and to do that. So then I start raising, I start talking to investors, I get rejections, right? And it's at a point where I've gotten like what 10, 11 rejections, and this is very hard because in my sort of pre-seed seed, in the first week itself we had like 6+ term sheets, so very different. And I'm like, okay, what's going wrong? Like I did the exact same thing 6 months back or like a year back, and then before that also, and it just worked magically, and now it's just not working. And the markets were bad, but I just thought that markets still rewarded growth. And then Sriram, our existing partner at A16Z, we have a chat, right? He tells me something very interesting. He said, and few very interesting lessons. He said, number one, you always have to know people always invest for emotional reasons, but they always reject for logical reasons. Your story isn't coming out, right? And you have to know that it wasn't the metrics, it wasn't those logical reasons that people invested in for.
Mm.
It's like numbers do matter more at Series A stage, but it is the emotional reason. Do people feel connected to your story? And the story is nowhere to be found. Because what I did was I made a memo, but unlike last time, I had a lot of numbers. So last time I actually had a story in my memo that people could relate to. This time it was just a bunch of fucking
Mm.
numbers because I just thought that's what led to our seed. And he was like, where is the story? Where is the customer? And he's like, that is what your strength is, or any startup's strength is, like knowing your customer and talking, like almost making the investor that you're pitching share the same experience that the customer shared and feel the same pain. So I'm like, okay, we have a few more pitches left, right? Including Sequoia. And what we're going to do is I'm going to redo the deck middle of the fundraising period, and I scrap the memo and I build a deck, and it's, I build it in one night, and it's very authentic, and it's like, okay, from the lens of a customer, and it tells a story, and it's not about metrics, it's not about much, right? Okay, sure, we do talk about metrics, but we lead on with the story. So that was learning number one. Learning number two was knowing the partner, right? Like, again, visas is something that not everyone relates to, right? And what happens is, when people don't relate to something and they've had somewhat of an experience with it, they tend to not understand how deep the problem is. Or like the way to think about it is market sizing is an extension of how deep you think is the problem, or how big you think is the problem. And then people are like, okay, if I did a visa once in 10 years, it can't be really that big. And it becomes really hard. So you're suddenly talking a lot of semantics. So my learning number two was, okay, go after investors that actually understand the problem. So you're not debating the problem. You're actually selling your solution. You're selling your story, right? You're not selling the market. And that was a big learning. Do not try to sell the market. Sell your story, right? So if you're selling the market, then it's like, my bottoms up analysis against yours, or my word against yours, and there's always proof that the market is not big enough. And we went from several rejections to term sheets from Sequoia and Elevation, and then 4 or 5 other term
Dude,
sheets.
I loved this. You had so many amazing gems in there, and you kind of added detail to some of the teaching that I put out there that is just amazing. And I wanted to highlight these things just so you don't think you're crazy. There are a few things that I wrote down. The first was I literally just had this conversation about we're producing content around it, where it's like there are advantages that certain people can have during a specific fundraise that will make that fundraise go extremely well and may set them up for failure in the next round. That's like any advantage, whether it's you are raising, coming out of an accelerator program like YC, or you have a really great network, and so your network funds you right away, or you're in a really hot market. all these things can lead you to believe like you don't need to put in a lot of effort or whatever. It's just going to happen the same way. So that experience is spot on. The second one is that everyone like can fall into this trap of thinking that convincing investors to invest in your company means something that it doesn't. Like that you have product market fit, that you know a scalable growth channel. Like you have convinced them that they should take a bet on your ability to get there. But founders will make this mistake over and over again, is that they're like, oh, well, they invested in us, so we're already there. And then they'll skip steps. And that can be a kiss of death. And then that third thing that I loved, which is this idea that the two-part sale, I think a two-part sale is really challenging when you're selling to customers, and it's really challenging when you're selling to investors, which is convince them that there's a need and then say you have the solution. Like that is always one of the most challenging sales. So if you can get to your ICP within your customer who understands the space, or your investor who like better understands the problem space, then you get to directly go into saying, this is why we have the solution. So I love that. And it's fun to even hear the story arc of you being memo and then coming back to the power of the deck and the storytelling power of the deck. So love that. Look, I think your grind has been amazing to get to just three amazing fundraisers.
And there is a third learning, just
Oh,
one more learning that I sort of got was that, and this was after the fundraise, right? Don't think you have a great business unless you have a great fucking business. And a great business, actually, and I think people in Silicon Valley sometimes don't really understand. A business is something that makes more, that where you make more money than you spend, right? And I feel like the only way you can weather a funding winter, and you can weather like tough conversations, and you can weather anything, and you can just be on your own and command your own terms, is when you've built a great business. So if
yeah.
you built that company where you're making more money than you're spending, then you can have all these luxuries. But if you haven't, knowing that you still rely on fundraising is important, because I think somewhat this pompousness sort of seeps in, where you think that, okay, investors want me and I don't want investors, and I don't want fundraising to run my company. And that's a lie, right? It's like you need it unless you build a business where you don't need it. And if you don't need it, that's great. Every investor will come to you,
Yep.
right? But if you need it, knowing is very important.
It's amazing. So Mohak, you had this amazing string of fundraisers and you're building a great business along the way. Well, a better business, and you're getting to that great business. At some point, you went from just killing it, knocking out of the park at all of your fundraisers, to that low point, right? Where like it wasn't working. Do you remember any like of the worst experiences during fundraising, things that really hurt or cut deep and felt terrible? Any stories come to mind?
Yeah, I think, a lot of them, honestly. Like, I think first was where investors would just lean you on, and then just show a lot of excitement until they wouldn't, right? I was lucky enough again to have a great cap table. And Ben Silberman, founder of Pinterest, who's done enough fundraisers himself, taught me that, look, it's not done until the money is in. He said it's not even about the term sheet. Unless the money is in the bank account, it's not done. You can't really lose focus on this. So yes, I mean, a lot of like, and it is demotivating, right? I'd be sort of like, the ideal me would want to say that, okay, I wasn't affected. It is demotivating. And I think one thing that sort of also helped me was that I was still managing fine to find enough time to continue to work on the product and the business.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, then at least it helps you stay grounded and helps you keep focused on what you were actually meant to
Yeah.
do. It's not to fundraise,
Yeah.
it's to build this product to solve a problem.
Tell me about the flip side moment. This would not be as fun to ask you about your seed round or your pre-seed angel round, but given where you were with a bunch of no's, VCs that were stringing you along, I love asking, do you remember where you were when Sequoia came to you and said, like, you know what, we want to do this. We want to do this with you. What was that experience like?
I remember, and we had to make a decision. We had a couple of other term sheets, right? And I remember I was at WeWork, and our Sequoia partner came, and we had to make a decision by 3 p.m. that day, right? And he reached the WeWork at 2:57 p.m. panting, and And he said, okay, we're into. And he's like, I just wanted to come in person and tell
Oh
you.
my God.
And I was like, okay, great. This
What a great feeling.
this exactly. And I had felt great, but I think the gesture also felt that they really cared. And I think till date that's true, that they care. And so does Elevation, and so do all other investors.
Awesome. Before the episode ended, I asked Mohak to share the craziest customer experience he had so far with Atlys. His answer was wild. Talk about divine timing.
Ah, so so many. I mean, I think the one that is very interesting is, and I might be going into some visa details, but it's like, uh, back when we were still figuring stuff out, I was at the airport. I was going to Dubai for some work, and I see this lady, and she's at the airport, and she's like, "Oh, here's my US visa, and let me board." And the airline's like, "No, you are not eligible." So people who have US visas are eligible for a visa on arrival. They're like, "No," and she's like, "What? I have to go meet my son. It's origin." And they're like, "Oh, your US visa has to be valid for 6 months or 180 days, and it's only valid for 177 days." I'm like, are you kidding me? And it's interesting because she said, "Okay, now what do I do?" They were like, "You have to change your flight." So it's like, "Okay, move me to the next flight." It's like, "Oh," and then the airline staff was like, "Ma'am, you're not going to get this visa for the next 3 days." And I was studying the Dubai visa, and I just thought from first principles that it should just take a couple of hours if it's fully automated. But there are like 10 layers of middlemen in between. Why do it? So I tell her with this crazy disbelief, too much belief actually. Be like, okay, look, you only have one option to make it to the flight. It is to use Atlas. If you download the app right now and try it, you will get the visa. Behind, like in my heart, I had no way. I knew one way that we've never experimented before, but we figured it out. And we never did a visa for Dubai before that. And she's like, okay. So she does it. And then I call my team. I'm like, look, we need to do this. We need to get this done. And again, nothing was automated, right? So she applies, the visa doesn't come. It's 15 minutes, it's 20 minutes. I'm like, okay, look, I'm going to rush to the gate and I'm going to try to hold them on. And you don't get a boarding pass, by the way. So she's still stuck at check in. And then the check in counter says that, look, I'm going to wait for 10 minutes, I'm going to close check in. And I go to the gate, and boarding's about to start, check in is almost closed, and she still convinces them to be open for another 5 minutes. And for some reason, the airline was delayed in getting out of the hangar, which is never really happens. And it was delayed by 5 minutes, and her visa comes
No way.
in those 5 minutes. And I'm like, okay, relieved. And then she does security first and then gets it. And then, I obviously board before, and she's the last one to board. I'm somewhere at the back, and I get a call from her. And I thought, okay, fuck, like, did we do something wrong? Was she not allowed to like board? I'm really scared. I pick up, I'm like, what happened? And she's like, I made it. God bless you all, and God bless Atlas. And that was it.
Wow. What a great, fun, heartwarming story.
It was just, yeah, exactly. But it is, I think we didn't do much, except like it was just crazy. Like I mean, it was crazy for me just to ask her, but glad that it worked out for her and that she was able to meet her.
So good. That was my conversation with Mohak Nahta, founder and CEO of Atlys, the world's leading visa platform. Let this be a reminder to those going out to fundraise that when things aren't working, switch up your perspective. You'd be surprised where it might take you. After the break, I'll be sitting down with my producer, Paige, to see if anything stumped her in this episode. If you're a crazy busy entrepreneur like me, I know one thing's certain. You have too much to do. Of course, you'd love to hire someone else to help, but I bet you think you can't afford it. It turns out you can, especially if you use a recruiting firm called Agent, like I have in recruiting my last 4 team members. Agent specializes in recruiting overseas talent. Now, I know what you're thinking, not another virtual assistant hiring agency. Yes, they can help you hire assistants, but they can also help you hire skilled talent like marketers, designers, and even engineers at a fraction of the cost. Now, if you're looking to add more leverage to your team, check out fundedpod.com/agent. That's AGENT to add your next team member. You can thank me later.
Hi, Jason. I'm actually not going to ask how you are because you feel obligated to say, yeah, I'm good. How are you? And then you just say good. So I'm just going to scratch that and get into
Maybe I'm not,
the
I have
debrief.
a bit of a back thing. I did a workout this morning and I'm feeling it, but overall good. So the question is still helpful. I appreciate you caring about my well-being. I'm doing relatively good. Thank you.
Don't try to push that back on me. No, but this is gonna be a fun debrief because I don't want to ramble about all of my thoughts on the episode, but I just wanted to point out some things that I really enjoyed about this. First off, I always enjoy when I see a founder talking about how they created a product that was to solve their own problem. I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm not saying every great product ever made is built this way, but so many amazing products I've found so far are built from founders trying to solve their own problems because they genuinely care about it and they're inspired by something that aggravates them in their own life. So I thought that was really fascinating. I also just wanted to touch on how I thought it was really cool how, you know, some of the founders we bring on we get to hear their story about the different rounds they raised, and you might cover some golden nuggets that get shared along the way. But I thought it was really cool how Mohawk took the initiative to take time throughout the episode to share some pieces of advice that he had for founders, and he
Yeah.
really was speaking to the listeners to be like, listen, and he would state something fascinating, and I just wanted to say I
Yeah.
appreciate him doing
Well,
that.
I really love Mohawk as a founder. I think he recognizes how difficult it is. And I met him very early on in his journey. So I've been able to watch this all go down. But he's just a lifelong learner. He loves kind of like tinkering around product, around problem solving, even around the fundraise. And so I think he is one of those guys who, once he learns something, he's not trying to like keep it to himself, or like feel like this is an advantage that I can't share with the world. He learns things, he shares it with people, he solves problems for himself, and then he generalizes it for everyone, just like he did with Atlys. So yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah, totally. I just wanted to highlight that because it was noticed if he's listening to this. But something else that I did want to talk about was I thought he had a really interesting story behind the origin of his product and how basically I found it very fascinating how he spoke about how he first gained traction for Atlas, which is I guess, we were coming out of COVID, which is so funny that he started like a travel startup during COVID. I can't even
Yeah.
imagine the horror. But anyways, COVID starts to get lifted a little bit and he notices that the Bahamas is making US citizens get a visa before traveling there. And the Bahamas is one of the only places you can travel to at the time. So he saw that and he was like, let's niche into this and let's capitalize off of this, which I think is brilliant. But I wanted to ask you a more, overview type of question around like, in your eyes, what do you think of that ideology? Like, what do you think
Yeah.
about when you're a super early startup? Is it better to niche down and find something to capitalize off of and expand from there? Or is there ever points where you could do the opposite?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it is a hotly, not debated, but discussed topic, because it can feel to founders like they are getting advice from investors to go in two very different directions. It's like, we're venture capitalists. We only invest in extremely large opportunity businesses that have a huge TAM that could be multi-billion-dollar companies. And yet, a lot of times you'll hear VCs say like, we like seeing people focus and show that they can actually execute, show that they're validating a problem. So which one do you do? Do you say like, we're going after this thing, we're going to change the travel universe? Or are we solving the visa problem for US citizens traveling to the Bahamas, like a tiny little niche? Um, yeah, it's a good question, Paige. And I'm glad you picked up on it. I think a lot of founders have the exact same question, which is why I love this segment. Um, the reality is that it has to be both. You have to be able to, in your story, but also the way you're executing, be pointed in a very big direction. The vector of your company has to be able to somehow in the future reach something very large. But at the same time, we need to know as investors and as the founder who's actually executing that you're solving a real problem, that you're validating that you can make a difference. And initial validation work goes way quicker when you niche down. As in, if you know exactly what the problem is, and you don't have to dilute your marketing language or your training language or your onboarding stuff to account for a bunch of different scenarios. Like for him, it's like, well, I guess we could be a visa thing for everyone. But the difference between a US traveler to India and what they're looking for and why they're traveling and the visa application is somewhat similar, but also very different from a US traveler who's trying to go to the
Yeah.
Bahamas and has to go through that visa application, right? Like one is probably much more vacation oriented. The other is probably like going to, a lot more going to see family or whatever. I'm just guessing. And if you have to make your product serve those two variations and 100 different other ones, it's very hard to talk to your customer and say, no, I have a problem solver for you. And we're going to solve your problem. And the experience that we build will be perfect for you. It might be a much smaller market, but at least you get to talk to one segment of customers and just know that you could speak directly to them and know that you can solve their problem really well. And then from there, if you're able to execute super quickly, you can then expand and expand and expand, which is what Mohak was able to do. The last thing I'll say is like, it is this balance point around how you execute and how you tell that story to VCs. But obviously Mohak was able to say like, we know we have a big vision. We're going to nail this market. Here are the things that we think is going to happen. And once we show you the results of that, you'll know that when we roll it out to the rest of the world, all different types of travel combinations, that this is going to be a huge opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the points you brought up. I think it's one of those things too where when you niche down to something super specific, it's also a way of proving that, a specific customer will use your product. Like he was able to prove that a big group of people use his product, enjoyed the process along the way. Yes, it was for something super specific, but now that, Atlys is on their radar, who says that they would go somewhere if they enjoyed their experience with that niched problem that was solved, then they're probably going to go back. So I was trying to think of it in the way of an investor's mind of like, because also on one end, there might be a fear of the investor thinking, okay, well, is this all that they can do though? Like, are they going to be able to expand past this niche? Because I think, there's also that fear of like, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but like of founders getting stuck in the niche mode, and then they're still trying to raise venture capital, which venture capital is all about scaling for a huge opportunity. So it's just such an interesting dynamic.
I think it's a good general question, like a question that we should generalize beyond just Mohawk's situation. And I'd say for Mohawk's situation, much easier, much easier for him to describe, look, we're doing the visa application for US travelers going to the Bahamas. And for him to be able to say, once we nail that, like, I'll just show you what the differences are for travelers to India, or travelers to Dubai or whatever. And so like that expansion feels like much more natural. But you're right that other cases, it can feel like a VC can feel like they are focusing on this one niche. What is going to actually get them to go to the next level, add on more features and whatever.
Yeah.
And that's where a bit of storytelling.
I feel like it comes down to the founder too. Like you'll be able to tell if that founder, it's one of those.
Yeah, right. Like if that's definitely part of the thing that a VC is looking for is like, do we feel like this founder just like is one of those people that is going to keep going, right? Like if they keep going and they max out this initial market, like is this a founder that's going to be like, sweet, I did it, I'm done? Or is it a founder that is like in love with the space, in love with the customer type, and just wants to continue to like add on, expand. And that is definitely something someone is going to be looking into. The other thing I'll add on to this very specific thing is, in certain situations, you can niche down and you can be in a niche, but like one of the things that I often help founders talk through is the fact that, we're starting in this niche, there are a lot of adjacent niches around me, but even this niche, if we just focus on this, is already like is a big business. So
Yeah.
having all those elements in how you tell the story and just show that you are a founder that wants to keep going are really important parts of that. And I definitely think Mohak has that in spades. He's just the guy that is going to continue marching and marching and marching. And I certainly saw that when I first met him. Put a little
Yeah.
angel
Like
check
I
in
noticed
because of what I
that.
saw. And then
Yeah.
other VCs have done the same thing.
Yeah, I noticed that just by listening to him this episode is you can tell he has a strategic mind in a lot of and he shows it through a lot of parts of his fundraising process. Like another thing that intrigued me was when he shared that he had thrown all of his investors from like all previous rounds, like angel rounds or the seed round, I believe. And for his series A, he had kind of mentioned in the group, he threw them into a WhatsApp, and he had mentioned in the WhatsApp group chat with all the investors, letting them know like that he was going to be raising, not for any specific ask, not for any specific purpose, just to let them know because he knew if he did that, they would probably be more likely to go to talk to their friends about it who are also investors, who are also in those spaces. And it seems like such a simple thing, right? But that is so strategic. And I just thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to do this, but it's funny. You start by trying to attract investors to get on your team, to invest in you, to join your cap table. And then once they're on your cap table, there's still the possibility of some gamesmanship and influencing them. I often talk about this idea of like actually gamifying the support you receive from your investors and like making it competitive. You know, one of those ways that Mohak was able to do it was put everyone into a WhatsApp group. So when he asks for help and somebody on the on the thread or in the group chat actually delivers the help, they say, I delivered the help. Mohak thanks them in front of everyone. And then everyone else who isn't helping is like, oh man, like this person is actually helping. And you know, this in particular is helpful in a company that's doing well, because as investors, you want to curry favor, you want to be
Oh
you
yeah.
wanted to be perceived by a great founder and a good company as one of the investors that helped along the way. It helps add to the reputation of investors and allows them to get other deals. And so, you know, not
Yeah.
everyone can like pit their investors against each other, but certainly as a company is taking off and doing well, there are a lot of opportunities to make sure that you get a lot of value out of your investors, like Mohawk did.
Yeah, that is a funny dynamic. It made me think like just how Mohawk wants to kind of plant these seeds to be introduced to other investors that he might want to work with. Investors also want to plant those seeds and help founders to hope like founders that they really think are
Yeah.
amazing to also hope to be introduced to other amazing founders through them. So it's kind of a two-way street. I never thought of it like that before.
Yeah, I think those are the type of subtleties around the venture capital founder relationship dynamic that I'm glad you start, are is crystallizing in your head, because like those dynamics really count in terms of your ability to fundraise, your ability to, get value out of your existing investors. But for sure, if Mohawk wants to get introduced to other VCs want Mohawk to talk to
Mhm.
other great founders and say, Jason Ye was amazing on the cap table,
Yep.
or XYZ was amazing. This firm was so good. And they also, that one other slight difference is they also want Mohawk to go to them and say like, hey, I just met an amazing founder. Like, I think you should definitely look at this, right? That's some of the best deal flow that a venture capitalist can get.
Mm. Yep. So touche, Mohawk. That's not the right word to use. I don't know why I just used touche, but
Bravo.
I mean, yeah.
Touche. Bravo, Mohawk.
I was
You
actually looking
are.
up what that meant like yesterday because I used it wrong. So let's just say,
No, I get the vibe. Bravo, Mohawk. We're very impressed with what you've done, both in your company and your fundraisers
mhm.
and your leveraging of your cap table to really build an amazing
Yes.
company. So yeah, that was an awesome conversation. If you're looking for more insights, strategies, and support around fundraising, subscribe to our weekly newsletter at fundedpod.com/newsletter. You can find me on social. I'm at Jayeh, that's Jayeyeh, on almost every platform. I respond to newsletter replies and DMs, so hit me up. This episode was produced by Paige Randall.
Hey guys.
Thanks also to Jono Lee from Adamant.
Hey everyone.
And as always, one last thanks to our fantastic sponsor, Vanta, the leading automated security and compliance platform.